them, and I have to go under, Jason.
Oh, yeah. I mean, listen, I'm talking from a betting perspective, which is why we've added this into our division previews. I mean, if you're betting the Jazz to win 54 or more games, you're crazy. And it's not a knock on the Jazz. It's just a credit to how good the West is this year and how good they will be for years to come. There's no way they're winning more than 53 games. I think high 40s, maybe 50, 51, but definitely not 54 over,
And
which
let
is why I
me
think they're.
no, I was just going to say, let me go a step further, Jason. I don't understand. If you're going to bet the over here, don't you have to consider betting them to win the West or the title overall? If you think that they're a team that's going to win 55, 56, 60 games, you have to believe that they're going to be able to potentially win the entire West, don't you?
Oh, no question about it, which is why I'm staying away from that bet because we didn't cover their floor. And I think they could miss the playoffs if there's an injury or if they don't mesh on the court as a unit. So, it's not a stretch to say that they'll miss the playoffs because the West is that good. I don't think it's going to happen, but, we're trying to cover top to bottom here. Anything's possible in the NBA with the exception of the Hornets being good. But yeah, I think their floor is missing the playoffs. Their ceiling is winning a round, maybe two, and they're going to be right there in the thick of it. Just not 54 wins good.
Yeah, and I think that's the issue here is their floor really is that to me, I think they'll be a playoff team regardless, but they could flame out. And if you don't see them winning 54 games, to me, I think that you have to feel like they could go well below. But if you really feel like they're a 55, 56 plus win team, to me, it's a bad bet to bet their over under. You're just not getting very good odds. If you really see this team winning more than that, I think you're better off putting your money on more of a future bet with them in terms of this is a team who I think could win the Western Conference or win the NBA Finals. Because if they're that caliber of team to win that many games and an absolutely loaded Western Conference, you've got to think bigger things are coming.
Yeah, and they definitely do in Salt Lake City. So now this is the fun part. Similar to how we covered the Wizards and the Hornets last week. I mean, these are the two teams in the division that you look at and you just say, nah. So we'll start with the Oklahoma City Thunder just because I think they're a little bit better than Minnesota. But where else to start by saying that this is the end of an era? Because if you ask Sam Presti, the general manager of the Thunder, if he thought heading into the offseason following that first-round loss to the Trailblazers where Dame waved bye-bye, he can trade away his two best players with Paul George and Russell Westbrook now moving on, I mean, he would have told you were nuts. But then, right when June 30th rolled around, there were rumblings. Paul George wanted out, then Russell Westbrook wanted out, and now the rebuild is officially on in Oklahoma City. So they get rid of Paul George. They bring in Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Danilo Gallinari, and then in the Westbrook trade, they get Chris Paul, who's probably the only notable NBA star right now, not a part of the championship picture, at least from the old guard, because there are some studs on bad teams. But, Chris Paul wanted to be elsewhere. His heart is probably not in Oklahoma City, so that'll be a factor. I mean, what are your overall thoughts on OKC here? Is the rebuild on, or are they still in that retooling phase?
Well, the thing that I find so funny about this team is the team that it reminds me of is last year's Clippers, Jason. I find it striking how much it reminds me of last year's Clippers because this feels like a team. First of all, I mean, I don't want to step on our over-under piece, but when you look at the over-under, you can tell that Vegas and the gambling public at large really have no idea what to do with this team because they don't know what Sam Presti wants to do. There's enough talent here for this team to be a contender for an 8 seed, but on the other hand, it's just as conceivable that they will tear this down to the studs, Jason, and trade anything of value that's not nailed down. And I think that's what makes this team so tough because there's already been rumors that they would be happy to move Chris Paul if they could get anything for him. Danilo Gallinari, you have to believe they're willing to trade him or Steven Adams if the right deal is there. So it's really hard to peg this team. But if we take them as the team they are now, the thing that's interesting to me, Jason, is the length of this team. They've been athletic for a while, but this team is really, really long across all their positions. They're just big and long, except for Chris Paul. And you do wonder how good this team could be if they do decide to keep it together, because it does sort of feel like the perfect team for Chris Paul. They're very good defensively. They just kind of need a leader, a guy who can go get them buckets and get some half court. And that's pretty much Chris Paul's bag at this stage of his career. He's not the point guard that he once was, but he can still get you a bucket and he can still run your offense. And so to me, this team is very, very interesting if they do keep it together. But I think that's the biggest question is, what will Sam Presti do? And will he decide to actually give this team a legitimate shot?
I'm actually shocked Steven Adams is still on the roster. I think once they tried to move CP3 and realized that they couldn't because of that monstrosity of a contract, they decided to keep Adams in OKC as the longest tenured member of this team along with Andre Roberson. CP3 is going to at least start the season with Oklahoma City. I mean, Miami could be an appealing destination if he wants to get out of there and go play with Jimmy Butler, but I think to do that, he'd be leaving a ton of money on the table. So let's preview this team thinking they're going to keep things as is. Their core is Chris Paul, Gilgeous-Alexander, Gallinari, Steven Adams, and then on the back end, you have Dennis Schroeder, Andre Roberson, and Nerlens Noel. So it's not a terrible team. You're not going to sit here and say they're going to win 12 games. But in the Western Conference, I just don't see how they can contend with this core. You got concerns with Chris Paul, even though Gilgeous-Alexander, I think, at the point, I mean, there's going to be a ton of scenarios where they're both on the court together. I think Gallinari, who had a borderline all-star year, if he could stay healthy, he'll be a nice piece on the wing. And then you have Steven Adams in the middle. So they'll be competitive, but enough to withstand the rigors of a full season in the West, I don't see it, man. I just don't.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so interesting with this team. I think, to me, the real piece is where do they get offense? If you look at this team, they're going to struggle to generate offense in the half court. They are. Andre Roberson, just not a guy who can really get buckets on his own. So where will this kind of play itself out? Will we see more Gallinari? Will he become a little bit more of an offensive player for them? And what will they do with him? He has really struggled with injuries throughout his career, and last year he stayed pretty healthy. He had one of his healthiest seasons he's had as a professional, and it makes you wonder, I mean, if he can sort of do that again, and then you see, a guy like Steven Adams is the other one who I think kind of just jumps out at you because he just has never had a chance to get any real offense, and he showcased some things. I mean, I am the biggest Steven Adams stan, but I have felt for a while that there is something there that is a little bit untapped. He has a great floater. I think he has a burgeoning post game. So I'm pretty interested to see this team, Jason. I mean, are we ready to kind of get to their stealing in the floor at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
So, I mean, for me, the ceiling of this team is competing for an 8 seed. And I think that means 40-something wins. I don't think that that's inconceivable. If they really do keep it together, Chris Paul stays healthy, I think this is a team that could compete for the 8th playoff spot in the West.
See, I don't. I think their ceiling is 35 wins. And again, similar to the Jazz, it's not a knock on the Thunder. It's a testament to how good the West is. They're not there. Like I said, Chris Paul is a huge health risk. Gilgeous-Alexander will get a chance to develop. He could end up being a borderline all-star or an all-star type. And that's why I think Sam Presti made that move, looking at the long-term prospects. Gilgeous-Alexander was a must-have in that Paul George trade. But this is not their year. I think Adams gets traded. I think CP3 finds a way out, and they top out at maybe 35 wins if things go well.
Yeah, I mean, on the other hand, you have the floor, and I mean, I think we've already touched on it. The floor is that Chris Paul, Steven Adams, Danilo Gallinari, and maybe even Andre Roberson are not on this team come All-Star break. And that is just as likely as them getting anywhere near an 8 seed. So for me, if that happens, I mean, they could legitimately challenge Memphis to be the worst team in the West. If they keep the roster together, I think that they're going to finish in the 30s probably for wins. They're not going to really be towards the bottom. And I think that that's why I would expect them to make some moves. But at the same time, it remains to be seen, Jason. That's why they play the games.
Which is why their over-under is super interesting, because DraftKings has it set at 33.5. I'm taking the over, but ever so slightly. I think they will reach their ceiling. But when it comes to, looking at the West, I think they're going to be one of the worst teams. So I'm going to take the over, but slightly, so bet with caution, kids.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm going to pick the over is I sort of got burned last year betting against the Clippers based on their incentives. And they were another team that ended up making the move, but they traded, in their case, Tobias Harris so late in the season that they had banked too many wins. And I sort of have a feeling that that might happen with the Thunder this year. By the time they ship some of these guys out, they might have banked too many wins to get the under, unless they really go into full tank mode. So I'm going to also go with the over here, Jason. I'm with you. And that brings us to our last team, Jason. We're going to the land of lakes. It's Minnesota, and it's the team that I think. Am I wrong in saying that you feel like this is the worst team in the division this year?
Yeah, I think they have to be almost by default. I like to call them the worst team in the division with one of the best players in the division with Karl Anthony Towns there. Cat, affectionately known by his peers, but he's great. But, they lost so much. They lost Derrick Rose. They lost Taj Gibson. They lost so many pieces, Tyus Jones. And when you think about what they got back, it is really not much. So heading into the season, I mean, they have a roster full of a bunch of naysayers, guys that will probably be out of the league in a couple of years. They have Jordan Bell, who I think will get more of an opportunity in Minnesota than he did in Golden State. You still have Robert Covington there, but they traded away Saric in that draft night trade. They get Jarrett Culver coming in the top 10 as a rookie. Jeff Teague's still there on the back end of his prime. So they have a couple pieces, but nothing too exciting. And you have to wonder, it's like, when will enough losing be enough for Karl Anthony Towns? And I know he signed that huge deal to stay in Minnesota, but even the players with the best outlooks and no egos get tired of losing. So I think his situation bears watching if the Timberwolves can't get their stuff together.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big problem for this team is point guard. Jeff Teague was washed last year. There's no two ways about it. And they didn't make a secret of the fact that they think Jarrett Culver can play some point guard. I'm not sure I agree with them, particularly as a rookie. I have my doubts. So I think that's where you start getting a little worried about this team, is that you look over the roster, Jason. Andrew Wiggins can't shoot. Jared Culver can't shoot, at least from three at this point. Who knows what we're getting from Covington? Jeff Teague's not a great shooter. And yet again, this leaves us with this kind of conundrum of Karl Anthony Towns being the best shooter on the roster, the best creator on the roster, pretty much the best everything on the roster. And that makes it very challenging to figure out what to do with him. I think if he was more perimeter oriented, that they would give him the ball more to set up the offense. But I'm just not sure what the younger Sanders is going to do with him as a head coach. And that's kind of going to be one of the mysteries, I think, of this season is how do they use Karl Anthony Towns? Because I don't know if this makes sense, Jason, but it's a strange thing when you have someone who is both the best initiator and the best finisher of a play, because you imagine synergy with a guy who's great at starting a play, creating the double team, getting it to someone who's good at finishing the play, whether that's a shooter, a dunker, what have you. The problem with this team is it feels like those two players are one and the same. And it makes it hard to figure out what they're going to do with Towns, because there's no one on this team who can really create the double to get him open looks other than him. And if he creates a double, then he's passing out to sort of inferior players. And I think sometimes when you watch this team, you get that sense from them that he really needs a second guy, and there's just no one on this team who can step up into that role, Jason.
That's a great point, because the second guy on that team was supposed to be Andrew Wiggins. He's heading into his, 15, 16, 17, sixth year in the league. And what has he done? I mean, one more bad year, I think he's officially coined a bust, not on the Anthony Bennett spectrum, but, for all the hype surrounding his drafting by Cleveland, getting traded to Minnesota for Kevin Love. I mean, he hasn't done much of anything since he's been in Minnesota. And if you're Tom Thibodeau and Ryan Saunders now, I mean, how frustrated are you that a kid with that much talent just can't put it all together? He's a streaky scorer. His playmaking ability is not what it was or what we thought it'd be coming out of Kansas. And that's a legitimate concern because, you look at that core of Wiggins drafted in 2014 and then Cat in 2015. I mean, the Timberwolves should have been West contenders by now. I mean, they rehabilitated Derrick Rose's career. They had some veterans in there. We used to call them Bulls North. on past shows, and it just hasn't worked out. So I think this is boom or bust time for Andrew Wiggins because the clock's going to strike midnight real